Hey everybody, welcome back. I am really looking forward to introducing you to Craig Spencer here today. He's the author of Witchcraft Unchained. It is about the history and traditions of the British craft, and it was published in 2023. However, it really goes over a lot of history and details that might have been overlooked or left out with the 1999 publication of Triumph of the Moon. It definitely adds a little bit of context in there. And so I wanted to bring Craig on the show today so that we could talk about 90s witchcraft from a traditional British witch's perspective. So welcome to the show, Craig Spencer.
Hi, thank you for having me. We said before we started, I'm really excited to be on the podcast, so thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. You've been on my list since I read your book. I was like, oh, I got to talk to Craig. So Craig, were you a 90s witch?
Surprisingly, yes, I was. That surprises a lot of people because I'm also a '90s kid. So
Yeah,
they find,
yeah.
yeah. So that's a bit of an odd one. The craft over here, particularly at that time, and particularly in the area that I lived, was really open and accessible. And so I also have witches in the family. So I started my craft sort of training really. It was informal, child friendly, of course, but it started when I was about 5 years old. So I'm definitely a 90s witch in that respect. I still have all my things from the 90s, a lot of them in the bookcase behind me. I actually dug out a book earlier today when I was thinking about this question, and um, it was actually a crystal scrying book that I got when my aunt was teaching me how to scry with my first crystal ball, which was the tiniest, cutest thing you've ever seen. And I actually only just realised today that it's actually a wise of oak that
Okay.
I had. So I was staying with the proper occult author publications even then in the 90s. So definitely a 90s witch, even though I was a kid. I was quite a hardcore kid though. I remember one time as well, this just came up the other day in my memory. I completely sort of forgot about it though, but sounds so bizarre because I always say, "Oh, I had quite a conventional childhood," and then I think of things like this, where when I was about 8, I would say 8, um, sort of really convincing my mum to take me to this particular occult shop, and we ended up in the back room where some lady called Elvira, not that Elvira,
Yeah.
was literally talking to me about conjuring demons. I was 8 years old, and she's like, "Demonic conjurations, let's have a go over it. Don't try this yourself. Wait until you're older, but here's some information about it if you want to know." And I took all that in. So, like I said, it was so accessible. An 8 year old could be taught about demonic conjurations from the Key of Solomon. So it was. I didn't have it in a
Wow.
conventional childhood, but it was conventional to me because I didn't know any different. And
Sure.
then I listened to other people's stories where they were taken to church as a kid, and I'm like, wow, my backstory is really different. So yes, definitely a night is
Yeah.
witch, and I will always stand on that hill, even though I was a kid at the time.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, I was probably a little older, but I was still young. I mean, I was an early teenager in the 90s when I started really moving into this. We're finding the books, finding the shops, all of those sorts of things as well. And so even though you were a kid in the 90s as a 90s witch, you were over in England. And let us know exactly where in England you are.
So I'm from. This is a point of contention, right? So I'm going to say
Okay.
something and then add to it. So technically, on a map, I'm from Greater Manchester, but
Okay.
we all dispute that we are from Greater Manchester. We're from Lancashire. But what happened is, for voting reasons, they broke our county into two halves and then renamed our half Greater Manchester. But culturally, we're still Lancastrians. So we're Lancastrians at heart. On my post says Lancashire on it. But if I get anything from abroad, because the computer does it, it says Greater Manchester on it. So I'm a Greater Mancunian, but I'm also a Lancastrian.
Okay.
I'm over from Liverpool, if that helps people with geography.
Yeah, not necessarily me. I'm terrible at geography, but I knew that you were in, that's in the north of England, correct? Because
Yeah,
when
the
I read your book, you're
Northwest.
talking about north and south and the differences in the craft there. Yeah. So as a 90s witch as a child in Lancashire, were you exposed to the same kind of media? Was that happening over there too? Was Charmed on? Was Sabrina the Teenage Witch on? Was Practical Magic showing over there? The
Yeah,
craft?
we had all those types of things. I actually, when it came to the craft, my mum watched it, knew I would love it, and then was like, "Here's a film you'll really enjoy. Here, go put it on." So I watched that because it was recommended to me. It was just like,
I
yeah, you'll
love
like
that.
this. Go put it on. Um, and Charmed, it was the same. My mum was looking through the TV magazine, one of them that says like what's on the TV. She came across it. It had the worst description for Charmed you could have imagined. And I remember that she went, "Go try this." She didn't bother watching it. She was just like, "Oh, you might want to watch this." And I said, "No, that sounds really boring." And she just went, "Just give it a go. And if by the first commercial break you don't like it, then you can go find something else to watch." And I went, I watched it upstairs. I had to hijack my mum's bedroom because that was the only upstairs room with a TV in it. So I was just sat there. And then as soon as the commercial break ran down, I ran down, interrupted her program to tell her everything that had just happened, and then went, "Oh, I hear it coming back on," and ran back upstairs. So yeah, I was obsessed with all those shows. They definitely impacted me in the 90s.
Oh, I love it. That is amazing. So what did you think about The Craft or Charmed or any of these things? I mean, were you old enough to know that there was a difference between the craft you were encountering in England, a more possibly traditional craft or an older style of the craft, and what was being displayed on all these American movies and television show programs that were using words like Wicca and Athame and like all of like what how did that interact with you and your understanding of witchcraft at the time?
I'll definitely use those two examples you've just given me because I think they were the two that I really did notice. So, in my county's dialect, we have a dialect called Lanky, which is just a mishmash of any language that has ever been spoken in this county,
Okay.
right back to Old English. We mash it all together and then we use it every day. That's why sometimes when I talk, I take little pauses because I try and not slip into the dialect because you wouldn't understand half the words coming out of my mouth.
Yeah.
So because it's a blend of Old English, Old Norse, Middle English, a slight bit of French, and then obviously modern English, all mixed together. So words like Wicca, which obviously originate in Old English, we still use that word, but for us it just means witch. So it's just a synonym. So when I heard through America it being presented as the name of a religion, that was quite a difference for me. That was a bit of a culture shock because I'm like, the word, because I just read it back then as the word witch, like I would
Uh-huh.
just the English word witch. So for me, it was like, wait, they've got a religion called witch in America. And then I remember talking to my granddad about this, and he just said to me, older generation, like my granddad, they just called everyone son, right? So he would just go, son, if it's wrote by Americans, don't get confused. They use different words. It's just a thing, It's like they're speaking English, but it's a different English. It's just
Oh, yes.
ignore it. Just carry on. So that's pretty much what I did. But that's how I learned a lot of American words was through the TV. And then
Hmm.
I would be like, wait, what? So I had to pick up on context clues. And then, as you mentioned, like Athame, like that's strange because how we would pronounce it over here in the north of England, we would set a theme. So it was like even
Same.
the pronunciation difference, but then I was used to that with other American words, so I just took it as it's an American pronunciation. I sort of just got over it, but it was a bit of a difference. But I loved American media because when my mum would do my grandma's hair for her at home, which was my nan is my mum's mum, and then my grandma is my
Okay.
nan's mum, if that makes sense. So she's technically my
Yeah.
great grandma. Um, and I would go into the living room, and it was always the time when reruns of Bewitched was on. So I would
I
always watch
love it.
Bewitched while she was doing her hair, and so I had all that type of stuff, and I loved it. So yeah, anything with a witch on it, if it was a TV interview, a program, I would be there as soon as it was on. I would watch it, and of course, like any 90s witch, I was obsessed with Endora. She was like
Oh,
the
yes.
best thing in the world.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Still obsessed with Endora. Yeah. What would
yeah,
Endora do? That's like my personal motto, right? Yeah.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
As for differences as such in beyond just vocabulary, though, I don't think I did notice anything major because for me, it was a, it was a strange thing because I sort of saw a lot of what was being said as I just assumed, oh well, that's what witchcraft is in America. So I just saw that as well, like a lot of people like that I was looking at the time. If it was TV interviews, they would probably say, oh, we're practicing. British traditional witchcraft. Where from my perspective, it was like, oh, this is American witchcraft because it
Uh-huh.
seemed so different. But I sort of just assumed, oh, well, that's what they have in America. It's not what I had interaction with. But that said, I didn't really know a lot about people like Doreen Valiente until I was in my teens. So that's not, it wasn't something I'd come across full stop. So I sort of
Uh-huh.
saw the origins of all that being in the US until I learned about these people, because my craft background was more rooted in a local tradition. So it's still
Yeah.
different anyway. So yeah, I just assumed it was an American craft, and then I found it. Oh, actually, no, it's another one of ours that moved over to the US. So yeah, I didn't really think much of it than just that's in America and that's interesting.
Yeah, and that is really interesting that you were like, oh, I mean, we'll just call it Gardnerian witchcraft. You're like, oh, that's American witchcraft, and obviously Gardner, came from England and Doreen Valiente and all of those things. So that's fascinating that you were already embedded in a witch culture, right? That did not. Uh, grow out of Gardnerian witchcraft per se. Maybe interacted with it later on. I think I've seen that almost everywhere. Is that eventually kind of like all craft traditions, kind of like we're like, oh yeah, okay, that's a good idea. Oh yeah, we'll do a little of this, and then we'll add a little of that, right? And so I think its influence is almost uh, universal, almost at this point, if not rooted there. And so that brings me to my next question, because you were saying the word Wicca was used just for the word witch in your area. Was it Wicca or was it Witcha? Was the word Wicca with like the hard C's, was that being used? Because I see that debated so much for people, right? That didn't happen until after Gardner.
No, definitely before. See, Gardner was actually from Lancashire, so I believe he got his pronunciation. And he says in, I think it's his first book, Witchcraft Today, I believe it
Mhm.
is. Anyone feel free, if you're listening, to correct me if I'm wrong on this. But he says when he was initiated, he didn't know what it was. And then he heard the word Wicca, and then he realized it was a witchcraft tradition that he was being initiated into. As a northerner, you hear Wicca and you would instantly think witch. And it was definitely the hard C. Gardner, though, used the single C a lot, which is also
Yes.
another word up here. It doesn't quite mean witch, but I sort of saw what he was doing with it. I think he was just trying to make a distinction with what he was doing. And
Hmm.
then the two C sort of just got slapped onto his stuff sort of after his death in a way. But yeah, we definitely use that hard C. I've dug into this after I've seen these debates myself, and what
Yeah.
I've found is that there's a theory that the feminine may have been pronounced like witcher, that E
Hmm.
would make a sound, but the male form definitely is a hard K sound. But then again, if the masculine and feminine, they wouldn't tend to generally change the accent either. So there is a bit of debate of where, how they definitely said it. But we know the masculine one was definitely a hard K, and we've always used the hard K for everybody here. So
Hmm.
I remember in the 90s, actually, just to quickly sidetrack a
Yeah.
little, we knew, like in my household, like I knew it was witchcraft. Like people in my family were witches, but outside the house, we weren't supposed to use the word witch,
Hmm.
and we just said Wicca because it was more socially acceptable. Not because it was socially acceptable because of Gardner, as far as my understanding is, as I got older, but more because, like, my grandma, for example, and even my nan, they were people who lived both before and after the repeal of the Witchcraft Act. When that was still in place, the biggest crime that you could actually get took to court over was actually using the word witch to self-describe yourself. So a lot of people just use regional dialect words as synonyms because it's then, oh well, technically I didn't say I was a witch, I said I was a Wicca. And then, like, in Cornwall, like anyone who knows Gemma Gary's work, they'll know that down there they use the word Pella, and it's just
Hmm.
people moved into these little folksy words that meant witch, but wouldn't, they technically weren't saying witch, so it was technically, oh, I'm not breaking the law on a technical, it was a bit of a loophole, really. And I think even though it had been repealed, it was sort of so ingrained that it was just a thing of, well, we don't say that outside. But then I remember I just carried on saying it anyway. And I remember one particular teacher of mine at school, I sort of mentioned about having witches in the family, and she called me a liar. And I was like, I'm not a liar. I have witches in my family. And so I came home. Oh, how was your day at school? Mentioned this story. So the next day, my mum and my nan went to school, and they went, "Oh, yeah, you said Craig lied about having witches in the family. We're the witches." And yeah, it was never. I was never called a liar over witches again. So
Well,
I
you
wasn't. I
it's
wasn't
really
present for the
truly today.
conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, like, that's a small example of something that I think really still happens a lot today. I mean, it's very much the academic stance that there were no people calling themselves witches, practicing witchcraft, and especially even as a spiritual path of any kind until Gardner. And I love in your book how you're like, well, that kind of seems like an egregious claim, right? That like this was the very first time that that ever happened. And you're like, and we've got all this cultural background from where I come from, right? That says that, no, we weren't necessarily running around naked and, doing all the Gardnerian stuff, but we were calling ourselves witches. We were practicing witchcraft. It was in our family. Might not have been considered a religion, but it sounds to me like it was considered a spiritual path, right, of connection to divinity or deities or land spirits or, around those sorts of things. And so, can you speak a little bit about that? Because I really feel that as much as I respect Hutton and Triumph of the Moon was this wonderful academic look at modern witchcraft for the first time, people still debate it, right? And very much because your stories, people like you exist, right? And so even today, people will get in heated arguments, calling maybe even you a liar, that you don't have a family tradition of witchcraft, people who called themselves witches, these sorts of things. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think the thing for me is just that even if you look, first I'm going to go on the history and then I'm going to address like myself personally. So in the
Great.
history books, we have a letter that is in the Houses of Parliament that was to an MP, which is a member of Parliament, for anyone who doesn't know, in the 1740s from my county, and it was wrote by a list of people, all using synonyms, so like pen names, whatever you want to call it, basically demanding the Witchcraft Act be repealed. And the reason for asking it to be repealed was they said there are that many witches who are known to be practicing and peddling their business as witches in this county. Everybody in the UK calls us the county of witches. You're not arresting us, so just let us call ourselves witches, because that's ultimately the only thing that the law's preventing us from doing, calling ourselves what we are. And then it's signed, I love by it, it's signed, I can't remember the name of the one, but it's like something, the fortune teller. And I think that's just her almost like twisting the knife a little of like, see what we're having to call ourselves, even though we all know it's witchcraft. And she even names the MP
Hmm.
that she's writing it to and says, everybody, it's even the word on the street that you or your recent promotion to somebody conjuring up a familiar spirit for you. She went, so we all know that we're peddling these services, repeal it. It didn't get repealed, as we know, because it was repealed in 1951. But there was obviously this thing in the county, even then in 1740 odd, that there was enough of a movement that people like, just let us call ourselves witches, get over it. And I don't think that them being rejected suddenly made them go, oh, well, let's just not be witches anymore. I just
Right,
think
right.
that's a flimsy argument. Then you see there's a book in 1900 and it talks about um, sort of, it says half a century prior, so obviously that's 1850s, and it talks about there's a big movement in Wales going on where people are actively practicing witchcraft, and it's just such an obscure little footnote, but it's there. It's like, and Wales isn't. North Wales isn't very far from where I am, and a lot of people moved across that border back and forward. Some of my family are from North Wales, moved up, some moved down. So there was a lot of exchange there. So I wouldn't be surprised if it sparked something off in Wales then of, oh, well, let's have some witchcraft here. I mean,
Hmm.
obviously, it took just one guy, which of course was Raymond Buckland, to go to the US, and it spread like
Hmm.
wildfire. So I think even just one person moving to Wales could have got that going, and it was a noteworthy reference in the book, you know.
Very.
So I just sort of think, well, we do have these little points in history where it pops up that people are calling themselves witches. So whether we want to say that that was authentic, they were a bit delusional, they were just sort of skipping around in the woods and having a good time, I think that's irrelevant.
Yeah.
The label was there, and I
Yep.
think to refute that, like you said, it's too academic that it's almost missing sort of what's logical. As for my family, there was a lady. Oh God, I can't even remember when she died, but I know it was before Gerald Gardner was born. And she used to work in. She was a bit of a local legend in the sense that she retired. Well, she died when she was at age 107, and
Wow.
she retired the year before as working in a pub. She was a barmaid, but people
Sounds like a
knew her
badass. I
because
like her
she was all
already.
yeah.
Yeah.
But she was also she was called Elizabeth Pearson, but people knew her locally as Betty Wape, and she was a local witch. But anything that you read on her, it always says in the history reference somewhere she was not a witch because of that Lancashire thing. But then they will then go on to talk about how she ran the local coven. She made love potions. She cursed people's enemies for them. She healed the sick. So it's like this woman's a witch. You know, let's face it. They just couldn't say it. And there was members of my family who were involved with whatever group she was running at that time. Um, so I know that
Hmm.
firsthand. You know, those stories have passed down. Certain recipes of hers have passed down. Some of them have been lost, like her famed love potion that everybody loved. I'd love to say that my family has that. We don't. It got lost somewhere, and we don't have this recipe. We don't know what was in it. And I would love to say
Don't
that I
write
do
Craig
know
for
this
the
super
love
secret
potion, people. Don't
recipe.
write Craig for the love potion. Yeah.
Yeah, but we do have two recipes of hers that got handed down because none of her kids wanted to pick it up. So she just
Wow.
sort of handed stuff over to people in my family, and then that just sort of got passed down.
What a
So
treasure.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, these things happened, and whether people want to give any credence to that, whether they want to say, "Oh well, Betty was a mad old lady who was in the pub and she made things up," maybe. But all I know is these recipes do what they're meant to do when they're made. So I mean, is that witchcraft? I say yes. So people
Yeah.
can say it's a lie, but these recipes exist.
Yeah, they absolutely exist. And I think sometimes they're always sort of contextualized. And I really feel like that they really do some Cirque du Soleil sort of like bending over backwards, right, to like make this work, right? But they try to make it to where, oh, all those people were cunning folk and they were just, they weren't witches, they were cunning folk. And that witches were just this entire conspiracy and people just believed in them as sort of this supernatural bad guy. And, yeah, okay, we're going to start, admitting, yes, everybody was doing a lot of magic in Europe still, right? And so, like, but none of them were witches. None of them were witches. They were something else, right? And I always thought that that was, to me, that seemed like such a leap, right? Especially with how ubiquitous the word witch and witchcraft was through all of these centuries as well, and what that related to even prior to uh, the medieval times. And so I am a little curious. I want to move a little bit into kind of a exploration of the spiritual side of this a little bit, and because I noticed this in your book, and I talked with another person on my show who was talking about the difference between British and American craft, and was talking about how in Britain that there is, from his experience and from some other people I've heard as well, that there's more of a focus on either the Horn God or the Dark Lord or something like that, right, over in Britain, and then it's more goddess focused over in the United States. And I was kind of curious if that tracks with you or what your experience is of that or how you would even contextualize that.
Yeah, I think it's possibly. I'll say it's both true and also a bit generalized. So I'm going to just
Yeah.
add a bit more context. So some craft traditions, they only work with one deity. So there's either just a god or just a goddess. So
Hmm.
if you have just a god and you brush up against that, then in comparison to the US, it's definitely going to look more male oriented, just for the fact that there's absence of goddess. If you sort of see what I'm saying, but then you'll have other groups that will be probably, I guess, so hard on the goddess, like, sort of bandwagon that they probably are a bit more intense than probably some people in the US. So I think it's just a mixed bag. I think it depends what people feel drawn to. A lot of it's land based. Like
Yeah.
here, we have a bit more of a free flowing thing, but we do have local deities who are still acknowledged, and it depends where you live too. Like people who live near the River Ribble, for example, there is an annual sacrifice that goes on there and it's not a blood sacrifice, I'll make that clear. It's a lot of alcohol, and it's poured into the river because it's said that if the river doesn't get fed every year, then it will take a life of somebody who's local. So you get witches who may not agree on what witchcraft is, what it looks like, and different traditions and paths. But if they live in that local area, they all come at a certain time, and they're all pouring alcohol into the River Ribble to make sure that the goddess is fed. And I think it's those little things sometimes where the local tradition sort of unifies people in ways that other things might make them separate. So they might be very male oriented to the rest of the year, but then they're going appeasing the goddess at the river. So
Hmm.
I think it's a mixed bag. I think it depends on where you're leaning into. Is it more a particular group's tradition, and then is there local traditions that are taking precedence over that? So I think sometimes it's sort of like like the Sunday Christians, like they're the people who are Christian like the rest of the week, but then they put on the Sunday
Yes.
best and then it's all praise Jesus. I think sometimes it can be like that, where if there's a context for it, people will honor it because it's sort of more a case of this is something that I'm supposed to do because I live here and it's part of the land. But then the
Mm.
rest of the time, they may have a completely unrelated craft practice. And I think people just sort of get on with it. I don't think there's a lot of um, I don't think it's too concrete one way or the other. I think it
Yeah.
can be quite fluid depending on the context, the scenario, the time of year. Like here, we have a local deity who we can track back to before we spoke English here, because he's we still speak a bit of Brittonic as well here. My name's a Brittonic name, for example, and his name literally translates into modern English as Old Spirit, and we honour
Hmm.
him because he is the witch's deity in our area. But at the same time, when it comes around to May Day, the May Queen thing is so huge. And then, what men? It's all about the women. It's all about the May Queen, the Rose Queen. It's all about that. And so in a way, even if you ignore goddesses at certain times, she thrusts herself on you in other ways, and you have to acknowledge it. And I always say on podcasts when I'm talking with people in the US, a lot of books from the US, this is one of the US things that always used to boggle me. They always used to
Yeah.
say, "Oh, this celebration that died out in like the 1600s in England, and it's never been done since." And I'm like, this procession goes past my house every year. Like, I don't live in the 1600s, so yeah, I don't know where some of these sources came from, but that was big in the 90s and the 2000s, of these dead festivals that don't exist anymore. And I'm like, I see these every year.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's a big difference. And it's even coming out more and more now. Like it's still something that people talk about, right? Is that like, oh, well, these weren't just nothing festivals, but I think that underneath it, and that was, and maybe you can correct me here if I'm off on this, but I think underneath it, it was sort of like taking, and I don't know, maybe this was just Gardner's angle on it, right? But it was almost like these festivals sometimes, unless you were part of the underground, if you would want to call it underground witch culture that was going on in England, maybe they would just look folksy to people. Like even now with, academics looking back at these celebrations and they're like, "Oh no, they're just folk celebrations. They're just folk celebrations, right? Totally Christian, totally this or whatever." And they emerged in these times. And do you think that part of it was trying to resuscitate a little bit of what they saw as maybe like a pagan or older meaning behind them? Or was that just always celebrated and then academics that made this whole other story and that got over to the United States and we were like, oh, these things don't really happen anymore, so we're going to do it again?
I think it's probably a little bit of both in some ways, because I'm sort of going to go off. on my example, but it is relevant to what we're talking about. So, for example, like when we get a new monarch in this country, we have a big coronation ceremony. But the small part that everyone seems to overlook on that is for our monarch to be legitimate, all the way back to when we first had monarchs, two things always have to happen. They have to be sat on a coronation stone, and
Hmm.
they have to pledge words or actions that symbolize that they have married the goddess of the land.
Hmm.
But then it's all wrapped up in this big Christian event with lots of hymns and praise God. But the legitimacy comes from those two things, the coronation stone and the sacred marriage. And then we sort of have these things in books where they say like, oh, this is how kings used to be legitimized. And it's like, well, I watched the coronation of King Charles, and just to make sure it was definitely done, so I can still say, yes, we still do that. When you
Yeah.
have goddess centered sort of spirituality, yes, it gets took over, and it might be seen by some as a folksy thing in some respects. No one would consider it legitimate if those two things were there. We
Right.
had a news coverage of the stone being installed into the seat. It's a saint's seat from back in the day because that's how the Christians legitimized it. But that seat's hollow underneath and has to have a stone installed into
Yep.
it before that seat is seen as a legitimate seat for the crown to be placed on his head or her head, whoever it is at the time. And it's like when we still have news coverage to show us like legitimately the stone has been installed into the seat, it will definitely be there. And these things are all about goddess worship, then I can't accept that it's all, probably some of it is folksy revival. I'm not going to be so blind as to say some of it probably isn't, because it probably is. But when we have such strong culture in this country of things that a goddess legitimizes,
Hmm.
I can't then go, oh well, I'm just ignoring our pagan past, because it's not our past. It's still there. It's in subtle places, but it is still there. And it's also, like you said, if you have, like, let's say, an underground perspective, you probably acknowledge the significance a little more. Like, we're people who will read books that talk about the old days where they had to be legitimate through a goddess. So we're going to notice that more than it just being, oh, this is some archaic throwback. That,
Right.
let's say, a Christian who's looking at it and sees the anointing as being the most important thing, because that's when some oil was blessed and it's the recipe from the Bible that's anointing on his head. So that's where they'll see the significance. But culturally, that stone and that marriage is the legitimizing element. So I can't ignore that a goddess is still very important in a head of state's position. It's like we elect MPs, the people who actually make decisions, but they still all ultimately get their authority from the crown, who is
Hmm.
somebody who's legitimized by a goddess. So I mean, thought about with logic, my
Right.
entire
Yes.
country's
Yes. It's pure
government
logic. Yep. Yep.
is under the blessing of a goddess. And I can't ignore that and then go, no, goddess revival and paganism's just all sort of folksy, wishful thinking from the 1950s, because this goes back all the way to when we were speaking Old English. So I,
Yes.
I just can't ignore that.
Right. And I'm so glad you wrote about that in your book too, because not only do you bring up that excellent example of at least somewhat of a pagan survival that happens in this coronation, but then also how the coronation in its steps very much mirrors a lot of witchcraft initiations. And so there's a lot of, talk about how, particularly with Gardnerian witchcraft, that it's Masonic, right? And you're like, well, maybe not quite just Masonic, right? And so, like, the steps of initiation, you can see that derive a lot from Gardnerian witchcraft today, and especially in the United States, but you can see those steps in the coronation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really people say that British witchcraft isn't an ethnic faith, which I agree with. You don't have to be British to be initiated, but at the same time, it is a cultural thing. Like a lot of things that we have that people. I mean, that's one of the things that Doreen Valiente always found funny about the oath of secrecy, because she said
Mhm.
For the most part, anybody with a library card could go and discover these so-called secrets because they come
Yeah.
from other places. But I think also there's the cultural things as well. Like I was talking with a Gardnerian recently, and well, actually, it was last year, but one of the things we were laughing at was between us was these sort of little differences that have come in, and one of them was when saluting the quarters, and they kiss the blade of the I'll
Mhm.
say athermi because that's how I get the Alexandrians say it, and they kiss the athermi and they say, oh, it's like blowing a kiss to the quarters in acknowledgement and greeting, and I was like, what in the Catholicism is this? That's all the kissing of
What the
things is like
Catholicism
what
is
happens
this?
in
That's
mass,
great.
you know um, and the way that it's done over here, at least how I was taught, was that you don't kiss the blade, you just bring it in front of your face and then you salute up and then you flick it down to your side, which we see in the trooping of the colours because it's a military salute. I'm calling an somewhat aggressive force to stand at the edge of the circle and protect me. So I'm expecting this to be a very martial, defensive, warrior-like figure. So I'm saluting it with a military salute, and I've never seen the
Uh-huh.
trooping of the colour when they're doing the similar flicks with their swords. I've never seen anybody blow a kiss with it, because that's not
Right.
military. It's an acknowledgement of something, and that's where it comes from. I mean, you also see this same thing in fencing because there was a time when the British monarch and the French monarch were the same person. So some of that goes into fencing too, where you see it where before they start, they tend to bring it in front of their face and then they flick it down to the side on the diagonal. So you'll see that a lot if you even YouTube it. And that is what happens in a circle too. And it's just meant to be an acknowledgement of, I'm acknowledging your abilities as a fighter, a combative
Guardian.
person, a defense. And it's sort of been culturally took to blowing a kiss, and I'm just like, I don't see where the culture of that is. So I
Well,
always say it's cult. Our culture's just in there, and they're not
yes.
secrets because the Trooping of the Colour happens on the BBC. It airs internationally if
Yes.
people want to watch it. These aren't secrets. People will
Right,
say
right.
I've oath broke by describing a salute that goes out on the BBC. But
Yeah, yeah.
it's true. I think I've gone off on a tangent here, but
No, that's okay because
yeah,
this is really leading to another question that I had for you is that how crazy did your family and people in your region think we were in the United States in the 90s with what we were doing with Wicca and witchcraft? Yeah.
I don't think people thought the material was crazy, but I think the biggest thing, because I still hear it, is that the word Wicca has become a religion.
Hmm.
And I think what people don't like is that things like books from Llewellyn are very popular over here. They fill the bookshop shelves. And if you go to that segment of a bookshop, the majority of the books will be from Llewellyn. You'll see that little moon stamped on the side. And a lot of them will say Wicca. And being particular, I think as well, because I live where we actually use that word. Perhaps in other parts of the country, it wouldn't be the same reaction. But it is this big eye roll of, is this what sort of, because culture as well in the UK is very weird. You can drive, not even an hour down the road and bump into people who are culturally quite different. We have pocket
Hmm.
communities of culture, and for us, it's like we're a really small nation, and then we're a small county within a small country, and it's like our culture is quite precious to us. We've clung on to it through
Absolutely.
invasions, multiple invasions, and now it's like these books with the little moon on the side, and this is what our language has become. It's become a religion. Like people will say, I remember my friend. So when I was a teen, so this would have been in the noughties. So one of my friends in high school, she spent a year. I don't know why. I still never know why this happened.
Okay.
Just for a year, her family just went, hey, let's move to the US. So she just went to school in the US for a year. And then the year after, they just moved back. And I don't know why that happened. Whether it was for work, I don't know. But it was just a year. And then she said, like, oh, you'd have loved it over there because of the people who practice witchcraft who were in the schools, people who she was talking to. And then one of them came for a visit. And I said, oh, well, actually, I didn't say it. My friend said, oh, this is Craig who I was telling you about. He's a witch. And she said, you mean a Wiccan? And the little eye spasm that I did, and I was just like,
Yeah.
yeah. And then I just went, we don't say that here, but yeah. Because I was like, well, she's sort of right, but I just said, we just don't use that word here. It's just witch and witchcraft. And then she found that like really confusing. She was like, wait, you guys don't say Wiccans here? And I was like, no. Because we do use the word Wiccan, but it's the plural of Wicca. So it's like I'm not a group of people. So it's like I'm a singular. So
Uh-huh.
I use the singular word, not the plural word. So Wiccan and then Wiccans is quite. I think that's the biggest thing that I think people find. It's not saying Americans are crazy. I think it's just how did America get to that? You know, like if Brits took it over there, how did this bit get so messed up? And I actually know why it got messed up. Actually, it was trademark in the US, and Llewellyn
Yes,
freaked out
okay,
about it,
great.
even
I
though
was
actually
gonna just
it
start
wasn't
in with this
relevant.
because I was like, I swear that Wicca took off as a word in the United States to mean this burgeoning opening of witchcraft as a spiritual practice, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it was in the 80s. I think people got freaked out about this trademark. Dr. Leo Martello, he trademarked Wicca, Wicca. So people
Oh,
didn't
Leo
want to.
Martello.
Yeah, and it was like
Okay,
the
cool.
Witches International something of America, and then obviously the acronym Wicca just with the single C. So Raymond Buckland started that one off. Llewellyn wouldn't let him put the single C in his book. He did. You look at Raymond Buckland's books; he always uses a single C when he's describing his background with Gardner. And then when the Big Blue Book came out, they made him put the double C in, and he wasn't a fan of that because when he went back to Wiser, when he did his CX Wicca, it went back to a single C. But that Big Blue Book, they wanted to circumvent the trademark, but then I think they also saw the marketing opportunity of, well, we can branch out beyond Gardnerians
Hmm.
because if it's a religion called Wicca, it can be anything. And obviously that helped people like Scott Cunningham because it literally was the title of his book. But
Yes.
I think when I've seen that book, I wonder whether that wasn't his idea because it does have that little note at the beginning where he does acknowledge that although it's being used both as witch and witchcraft in the book, he acknowledges he is aware it is the Old English word for witch, and it's just like a little tiny sentence on a page on its own, if I remember correctly. And I think he probably insisted, like, I want people to know I actually know what this word means,
Hmm.
which is a shame because it's now the reason that's given to justify the name, even though he was sort of like, I know this isn't right, but it's the direction the publisher's going in. But yeah, I know from somebody who knew Raymond Buckland, and they asked him once before he died, what was his one regret of his publishing career, and he said the Big Blue Book. He just
Oh
spat
my
that out.
gosh, the
He didn't
one
even he didn't even
regret.
wait for a second. They were sat on the
Wow.
sidewalk and he just went the Big Blue Book. And I think it was because of the changes, because also that's where Athame, as far as I know, as a pronunciation first comes in.
Ah,
But
okay.
before that, he'd done a VHS, Buckland,
Yep,
and
yep.
in that he says, how does he pronounce that? Athame, and that was him already bending because he was finding the groups at the time struggling to say Athame, so he softened it to Athame, and then it became Athame, so it got softened down again. And I think for him it was um, too much being changed
Yeah, too
in the
much of a
terminology.
linguistic drift there about what's
Yeah,
going
and I
on.
think that
Yeah.
was why it was his regret. I think that's why he reinstated the 1C when he went back to Wiser and just shoved it on the cover of the next book.
That
That's a
is so
speculation on my
interesting.
part.
That is so interesting, and it just makes me think that there's this whole other thread in here that I don't know all the details of, but I know that this had a big impact, and I mean, including even after the repeal of the Witchcraft Act in England in 1951, is that it was already religiously contextualized, right? It was about like, if it wasn't freedom to practice a religion, it was freedom from the religion that didn't want you to do this initially, or something like that, right? So it was always kind of contextualized a little bit in terms of religious rights. And then in the United States, obviously, that took off even more because of our culture, right? And uh, I think people were starting to create institutions, and I think it was starting to be like, well, what do we call it? And we're going to call it a religion so that we can have religious rights, right? I think is kind of a huge factor that was happening there too, that we're going to put this under this umbrella so that we can practice freely, we can have our rights. Would you say that that's accurate from your perspective?
I think it is because I mean you can like just set up a church because you have this so that freedom of religion thing that's took very much sort of more seriously, I want to say in one respect than it is over here. It's not that we don't have it; it's that
Mm-hmm.
it's somewhat more difficult, I think. Just the way that it's done. Like technically, hand fastings would be legal in England, but the only thing is, if you have a religious service, you have to have a regular place of worship that's a registered place of worship. And how many of us are investing in opening a temple? We're not. Most people are doing this in the woods, in someone's living room. It's like
Mm-hmm.
so we don't have a dedicated building that is just for religious services because also when we're occultists to a point as
Right.
well, a lot of what we do is private. We're not opening the doors to anyone who decides to walk in off the street. And I think because we don't have sermons, it just makes it a little difficult in how our legal situation is. But it's not that we can't. I think it's just jumping through all the technicalities of it, where you don't have to do that in the US. You can literally still have a very occult group and just register as church,
Right.
which I think is more logical. So that's definitely one thing I wish was over here because it would just be so much easier. But yeah, I think that it's fair to say that just using it as a word was convenient, and also as well, I think you through the 90's still had the Satanic Panic lingering.
Absolutely, in the United
Yeah,
States for sure. Yeah.
yeah, so you couldn't really be using the word witch and witchcraft. So I think it just softened it. It definitely made it easier. Probably, like I said before, anyway, when the Witchcraft Act was still in force over here, people just didn't use the word witch. And I
Right.
think it was probably the same thing. People were being persecuted because of the Satanic Panic. So they just
Yeah.
used something else that was convenient. But I do remember stumbling across in some research two court cases in the US.
Okay.
And they're both religious discrimination cases, and they both use a word that is a word we have over here that we would actually use to describe the religion if we weren't calling it witchcraft. And it's very much like Wiccan. It's Wiccan. So it has just an
Oh,
extra I in
Witchian
there.
almost.
It would
Wiccan,
be pronounced
Witchian.
Witchian or Wiccan, yeah. Or you could actually, if you were pronouncing it in Middle English with that type of accent, it would be Wishan.
Wishin.
Wishan, like magician, where
Yeah.
the I makes the sh sound. So, and that was mentioned in two separate cases where the people actually declared that as their religion. And I thought that was really interesting because I don't have a clue how that word got there because I know it wasn't being used in
Right.
Gardnerian circles. So I'm like, who carried that word over to the US enough that it was spread so that in two separate states, two people
Yes.
were sort of doing
Do you remember
lawsuits
what
for
states
religious
they were in?
discrimination? I can. It was probably about 2 years ago. I
That's
stumbled
okay.
across
That's
these.
okay. I was
If
just
I
really
if I find them
curious.
again, I'll let you know. But yeah, I
Yeah,
was
please
actually
do.
really intrigued that the word had actually got over there, and it was being used. I think it was in the 80's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is really fascinating. And I think just another example of how this was already something that was, for maybe even lack of a better word, an identity that people were claiming and even probably brought over from where you were, right? If that's the word, that has gone kind of unmarked, I would say, in history and in describing this history. So, Craig, as we start to move a little bit towards the end of our episode here today, I was curious if there was anything about the 90's and how it shaped witchcraft that really stands out to you now in 2025. From your perspective, as coming from a culture of witchcraft that was beyond the revival of witchcraft. And yeah, what would you say how would you say the 90's have changed that from your perspective?
I actually think the 90's, from the way I experienced it, had certain impacts that are still sort of about. I was thinking about this earlier today, actually. And I was thinking about in the 1970s, the TV shows that were on at the time then, that were written by Richard Carpenter, I think is just somebody who doesn't go noticed in the community, but he wrote a lot of very occult programs or things that had occult elements, but he never vocally ever admitted to having an occult background, but it's kind of really obvious. The
Okay.
two that really stood out to me is there's Catweasel, which if you've ever seen an image of Catweasel is literally Gerald Gardner. But he just
Okay.
says, yeah, but he just said, I just imagined a guy who was a cross between a cat and a weasel, and then I just decided he was going to be an occult time traveling practitioner of magic. And I'm like, this dude with the stuck up white hair and beard, this is just Gerald Gardner. And one of my favorite episodes, I can never remember what it's called, but it's in the first season, and it's got broom or broomstick in the title. I'm sure it's going to be on YouTube. And the police chief, or whatever he's called, I can't think what he's called in the episode, he gets convinced that there's a coven of witches somewhere in the village, and there's a scene where he is actually reading books at his desk, and he's actually reading one of Gerald Gardner's books. So it's like, oh,
Wow.
it's so obvious that Richard Carpenter knew who Gerald Gardner was and made this character on. But the biggest one that I think people over here definitely are aware of is Robin of Sherwood, because the
Ah.
idea in there, you see a man who channels the horned god who's called Herne the Hunter, and he sort of is the driving sort of background character who drives all like the sort of adventures. And how we see horned gods in literature in the 90s is directly taken from how Richard Carpenter's depiction was on screen in the 1970s. So it obviously made
Wow.
enough of an impact that it carried on making that image in 90s books. And I think you still, if you look at horned gods, I think they're still being talked about today like they are in the 90s. So I
Oh
think
yeah.
that's the biggest impact. I think the goddess has gone through so many transformations. I think when you come to the horned god, I don't think people probably theorize on him too much. I think he's just sort of there, he is what he is, and we haven't really changed. If we talk about that character or persona or deity or whatever you want to call it, it's always pretty much the same thing. Where goddesses, images of goddesses, they change so much decade to decade. Where like, do you remember in the 2010s, like everything was just the dark goddess, dark, ooh,
Oh yes,
spooky,
absolutely.
and now it's all something else, and then before that it was something else. But yeah, I think from the 90s, I think the biggest impact is the depiction of God. I think even when people like use like images of Baphomet, there's still
Hmm.
like, if they're trying to bring it into a pagan background, I've got a little statue of him over here. But he, I think when people try and focus him through a less satanic lens, they end up just transferring this Herne Canunos character onto him anyway. So I make it a him and not just like this sort of fluid being that's depicted. So I
That's a
think
good
a lot
point.
of that
Yeah.
is like, no matter what it is, I think it gets that Herne the Hunter from Robin of Sherwood stamp on it anyway. So I think that's probably the biggest impact of the 90s was 70s media. I think that influenced people, then they became the authors, and then they shaped our minds, and then that just became the narrative that we sort of stuck with.
That totally tracks with what I know about witch media, particularly in the United States and how things evolved. It was even in the 70s that I think it's now called Season of the Witch came out. That was one of the first like semi-accurate depictions of witchcraft. Very semi. It combined a lot of things, but I think it was one of the first times that they used um we'll just say real artifacts, both physical and intellectual, in that movie. And I can see that progression. Yes, and media utterly shaped witchcraft in the 90s. And so, of course, it would reference back to what was even happening in the 70s. And you can even see witch media still influencing current, or 90s witch media still influencing current witch media, with even like Agatha all along. Like, I mean, it's its own unique thing, but like it's loaded with 90s witchcraft themes, and it exists because of the new image of the witch in media that emerged in the United States in the 90s.
Absolutely, yeah. I loved Agatha all along just
I
for that
loved
reason
it.
as
Yeah.
well. I thought, look, all the things that our community hated for like 9 episodes, everyone loved it again, because it was there in the media. And I sort of thought, I just sort of wish we could just do that anyway. I think we had such good things in the 90s that we sort of don't have now. And I think
Agree.
it would be great to revive some of that stuff again. And I think that did a really good job of injecting certain ideas back into people's minds, particularly new people in the community who probably
Yes.
didn't have any connection to the 90s witchcraft.
Yes, and like I so agree with you because the biggest one that I'm still hoping is the seed that can grow is that it how important the coven is, and I don't mean like a bound coven or like or whatever, right? But how important your community is, how important it is to I've been a solitaire for a long time and I've gone off and on. I've been part of circles, I've been part of covens, right? But I've practiced on my own for a long time as well. And there's you can absolutely do it on your own, but there is something important and special and just even practical about connecting with a group. Would you
Yeah,
say that's
yeah,
true?
absolutely. I think so, yeah. And I actually agree with you wholeheartedly that it doesn't have to be a particular, cookie cutter type coven, but episode 7 on that where she turns that tarot card. Sorry for spoilers, I'm going to try and keep it simple, but where she acknowledges that she needed that group of people. And I think that's something that a lot of us felt. It was like an arrow in the heart. We all felt that on some level. I think particularly if we were involved with witchcraft in the 90s, because it is that theme that community is important in some way, and we had community. I think it's weird that we have such instant internet today, and we find it harder to be social than we did in the 90s when like you didn't have really instantaneous things, and if there was one picture on a website it took forever to load up, and we
Yes.
still used these platforms. And I mean, I even got my mum to log me into like certain groups because I was too young to join them, but then it was like I'll just be the silent person who's just scrolling and just reading. But
Yeah.
it was still community and it was important. And I think we're sort of less sociable when we're more connected than we were in the 90s when we couldn't even make a phone call if we were on the internet, and yet we still managed to build community through all these hurdles.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that's a huge thing that I would love to represent with this show too, is that, it was a huge driving factor, and not just because we should, also because it's what changed culture, right? It's what literally made such a big impact is that we were working together and we weren't just necessarily a bunch of individuals doing our own thing all the time, which is great. I'm an introvert. I like to do my own thing a lot of times too, right? But it only goes so far in many respects. So, Craig, before we finish, I heard you say something earlier. What groups were you a part of on the internet when you were too young to be? Was it a
Oh,
Yahoo group, an AOL
I
group?
it probably was an AOL group, but I can't actually remember what it was called. I was actually thinking the other day, um, what groups were they, and I just couldn't remember. But I also remember a website, and I'm dying to know if anyone's listening to this, if they remember this website, because I actually stumbled across a really, really old website the other day, and then I sort of lost it again. But I was like, oh my God, I remember this website. And it was still like really like poor graphics on it. And I was like, oh my God, I
Yeah.
remember this website. But there was one website, and it was set out just like an open book, and it was somebody who just, whether it was a community thing, I don't remember, or whether it was one person's thing, but they'd almost made like a digital book of shadows, and the whole website was just set out like a book, and it had a
Oh.
content on it, but then it also had a content bar on the bottom where you could click and then select what you want to go to, and it would just
Oh, I
turn to
kind of
that
remember that
page.
too, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like that had like some really great stuff in there. It had like ritual spells, but also like tips. And I remember that being one that I would go back to just to find out what was going on in the world, because I'm sure people could add to it. I think it was a community thing. I think it used to
Hmm.
start with who had added it in there. And I can't for the life of me even remember what it was called to even see if it still exists somewhere buried on the internet. But if anyone knows what that is, please let me know if it's still there, because I would love to dig that back
Yes.
out. Because if it exists, I'm gonna plug the hell out of that website and be like,
Yeah.
everyone, look at this website. It's so basic, but it was good.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Craig, thank you so much for coming on the show today. And had a really great time talking with you. I'd love to have you back on sometime. And everybody who is watching and listening, go check out Witchcraft Unchained. This is a awesome book that's going to open your mind and give you some more background in history that maybe we don't talk about a whole lot, especially here in the United States, when it comes to the history of witchcraft and the revival of witchcraft. So, Craig, thank you again for being here, and we'll see you all soon.